All right, good evening, everyone. We are working with In Divine Friendship by Swami Kriyananda, collection of his letters over many years. We're about 2/3 of the way, 3/4 of the way through the book. So, let's start now with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to feel your living presence within us, that whenever a doubt or a question or a fear arises, your vibration will also come into our hearts, into our minds, drawing us back to the only answer to every dilemma, which is ever deeper attunement, surrender, faith in your guiding presence. We are your children. Bless us and lead us home to thee. Om. Peace. Amen.
I'm determined no more to want to play. I'm determined no more to play. I'm determined no more. I'm determined no more. I'm determined no more to play. I'm determined no more to want to play. I'm determined no more to play. I'm determined no more. I'm determined no more. I'm determined no more to play. I'm determined no more to want to play. I'm determined no more to play. I'm determined no more. I'm determined no more. I'm determined no more to play. I'm determined no more to want to play. I'm determined no more to play. I'm determined no more. I'm determined no more. I'm determined no more to play. I'm determined no more to want to play. I'm determined no more to play. I'm determined no more. I'm determined no more. I'm determined no more to play. I'm determined no more to want to play. I'm determined no more to play. I'm determined no more. I'm determined no more. I'm determined no more to play. I'm determined no more to want to play. I'm determined no more to play. I'm determined no more. I'm determined no more. I'm determined no more to play. I'm determined no more to want to play. I'm determined no more to play. I'm determined no more. I'm determined no more. I'm determined no more to play. I'm determined no more. I'm determined no more. I'm determined no more to play. I'm determined no more. I'm determined no more. I'm determined no more to play. I want only thee, Lord, thee, only thee. 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 I want only thee, Lord, thee, only I want only thee, Lord, thee, only thee. 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 I want only thee, Lord, thee, only thee.
Okay. Okay, my friends. So here we are, and we're right here. We're in the section of the book called Leadership. We have a couple of more letters about leadership, and then the section after that is Yoga and Christianity. So this letter, as it turns out, is a letter to me, which I thought was true. It's somewhat edited in the book. I'm not quite sure exactly why they edited it down, but I went and found the original version of the letter. Oh, let's see. Yes, I found the original version of the letter, which makes a little more sense to me than the one that's written here. So it's my name isn't on it, but I just recognized it. It's cautions an Ananda colony leader not to fear offending wealthy parishioners. That's how it's dedicated. It's November 2002. He writes, "Dear, as it happens, dear Asha, I hope you like the version of Chapter 3 of God is for Everyone sent this morning, better than the one I sent you yesterday." This is the book he was working with, what he's talking about. God is for everyone, and he was following his habit of sending the chapters as he finished them to a group of 20 or something of us who would comment. And I always made a point of reading it immediately. I would tend to drop whatever else I was doing and read it as soon as I could and respond to him. So I'll read the letter as it appears in this book, and then I'll fill it in a little. I confess, however, to a slight uneasiness in your reaction. I would not like to see you develop the tendency so common to priests and ministers everywhere of fearing to offend your more wealthy parishioners on the matter of material possessions. That's interesting by itself. I'll just fill it in. I'll just read the whole letter, which is short. I don't agree with you on the subject of making this story taboo because it deals with creativity. Creativity, too, after all, is part of delusion, as long as it springs from egoic desire. And that's, I have to admit, without casting aspersions on the editor, that's pretty obscure what he's talking about. So here's what the deal was, and I can give you the bigger part of the story. In chapter 3, Swami is trying to talk to people about what is the real goal of life. And so he's talking about the fact that we think that having material possessions is really going to make us happy, but we find that the acquisition eases the stress of the desire for a short period of time, but then familiarity sets in and we have to go keep wanting new things in order to keep getting the same sense of satisfaction from material objects. And to illustrate the point, he tells this story about somebody walking down the street on a very beautiful day, enjoying the sunshine and the flowers and the birds, and then having the idea, if I only had a camera and could capture this beautiful scene on film, then I would be much happier. So then he describes how, having manufactured this desire, the person then suddenly doesn't enjoy the day as much and has to go earn money and save money and get the camera. Then he has the camera and he's so excited about the camera, and the camera makes him so happy. He takes lots of pictures, but then gradually the camera becomes familiar, the experience of taking pictures becomes familiar, and the satisfaction that he hoped to get from the camera wanes. Now, I've never liked that story. This wasn't the first time I'd heard it. This book is actually a rewrite of Master's book called The Science of Religion. And that book was ghostwritten on Master's ideas, and Swami rewrote the book, feeling since the first one was written by a disciple, he could write it also as a disciple. Legally, he wasn't allowed to say it was written by Yogananda because we got a lot of pushback from the original publishers of Science of Religion. So he had to change the name, and so it says in very small letters here, inspired by Paramahansa Yogananda, and that's how he got around it. God is for everyone. Now, I never heard Swami defend that story on the basis of it having been Master's story, because when he wrote this book, Master wrote Science of Religion in 1920, and Swami, when he talks about writing this book, it was very challenging because he couldn't use he had to stay within Master's time frame. He couldn't use any experiences with Master of his own because he was trying to write the book as Master would have wanted it written. But I never heard Swami justify the use of that story on the basis of Master using it, but maybe he did. Although I don't know how widely available cameras were for individuals at that time, but perhaps they were. But I've heard Swami use that story many times in other contexts, and I've never liked it. And the reason I've never liked it is this. To me, a camera is a tool, and it's a tool for doing something creative. And therefore, it has never felt to me like it fulfills the criteria of an inert material object, trying to get an inert material object to give you satisfaction. I've expressed my, especially in this case. And so when Swami sent the chapter, I wrote back and I took the opportunity to express myself and say that I didn't think it was a good story because I thought it was more a story about creativity. And if the person was being really creative with his camera, it wouldn't disappoint him in the same way. Swami rejected my objection, and he writes a little bit more here, however. He also says, I hope you like the version of chapter 3 sent this morning better than the one I sent you yesterday. I myself could see instantly on reading it that I'd come into my camera example too abruptly. I wasn't able to find his earlier rendition of the chapter. I lost a lot of things in my computer at a certain point. I had his letter because I printed it out, but I didn't have the exchange between us. He says, then he goes on, I confess, however, to a slight uneasiness in your reaction. And then these are the same sentences. I would not like to see you develop the tendency of fearing to offend your wealthy parishioners on the subject of material possessions. Then he goes on, I don't agree with you on the subject of making this story basically as it was taboo because it deals with creativity. Creativity, too, after all, is part of delusion, as long as it springs from egoic desire. And so it's the same words that were printed in the other book, but you understand the context, why I objected to it. And he just says that even the desire, creativity too, is a delusion if you're doing it for egoic reasons, and therefore it will disappoint you if you're doing it for egoic reasons. And therefore he felt my objection to the camera as an example was not sufficient to disregard it. And then he says, well, I do think you'll like this newer version much better. My concern was that your misgivings had been expressed not just over chapter 3, but all the way to my story about the cottage, which was much later in the manuscript. Maybe it wasn't only that I had a fever, Swami wrote this late at night, but that you were tired. It was late at night after all. So Swami himself was tired when he got my answer. He wasn't feeling well when he got my answer. And what sometimes happens to Swamiji is he just gets fed up with input. He's just had enough of people giving him. He sends his manuscript out to everyone. We respond, and then sometimes he's tired of that. I think in the earlier letter about leadership, he talked about asking for people's input, and sometimes it tries his patience, and this was a case in which my input tried his patience. And it was also late at night, because sometimes he would write late at night, and if I got it late at night, I would read and respond to him right away. I always responded very, very often. Now, let's see, what was the other part? Oh, yes. What I wanted to say is he was also taking the opportunity to say something to me that he wanted to say to me. And how he connected the two, I don't know, but there must have been something that I wrote that made him think that. I'm surprised because this is all the way in 2002. Fear of offending your wealthy parishioners. He knows that my issue wasn't money. It wasn't that I was concerned about money and trying to get money from people or something like that. That was never his concern for me. It wasn't that I was trying to cultivate wealthy parishioners as such. You know what he means. But what I sometimes have a feeling, and this is what he told me much earlier than this, that's why I was surprised it was still active in 2002. When he was talking to a group of us once who were all beginning to have ministerial roles, he was speaking to this other friend of mine, person, and was saying to that one that that person was too, when he spoke, he was too enamored of his own ideas. And the impression that that person gave when he was talking was that he loved spinning his ideas. And they were good ideas, beautiful ideas, well articulated. And so other people could enjoy them. But it was like his primary focus was the ideas he was putting out. And then Swami turned to me and said, by contrast, because of the way I'm constituted, I was acutely aware of the reaction I was getting all the time. And as a consequence of that, too often, Swami said, I molded my message to what people wanted to hear rather than what God wanted them to hear. And that's what he was referring to. So what he was concerned about was that if I start talking about the evils of materialism or the folly of materialism, and there was more in chapter 3 about wealthy people, and the whole of chapter 3 is about how wealthy people are often more unhappy than people who are just sort of rising up through the social ranks, people rising up through the social ranks imagine that if they can just work hard enough to get success and get money, then they'll be happy. So they have this expectation that when circumstances are different, then happiness will come to them. Wealthy people, by contrast, because they can fulfill any desire, actually end up being often much more unhappy. Suicide rates are much more among the wealthy than they are among ordinary people, middle class or lower class people, financially I mean. Because the wealthy people, the illusion is shattered. So it wasn't just the question of buying a camera that Swami was concerned about in the whole chapter. It was the very strong and flat way that he was speaking against the folly of materialism altogether. And so he wanted to make sure that I wasn't caught up in that. So, I mean, I took his advice seriously. I can't recall, of course it was 20 years ago, I can't recall any other context why Swami would have said that to me. But there may have been something that I've forgotten. Because I never want to be presumptuous about delusions, but I don't ever recall my actually cultivating people with money. I just can't ever think about doing that. I've been grateful when people who have discretionary wealth put it into helping our work, and it's been tremendous generosity of a lot of people that has enabled the Palo Alto community where I live to succeed. But I don't think I've ever been afraid, except I know what he is saying. The other part of it, which I put out, which is a sort of awareness of people's resistance. In fact, Ekavir, I'm being slightly confused because I see this blue cord that's not plugged into anything. Is it because we're on Wi-Fi instead of on the wire? Okay, thank you. It was distracting my mind. We've had what some of my techies call certain death buttons that are death to the broadcast that we're concerned about. Did you want to do something about it or no? Okay. It's fine. Okay, very good. Thank you. We recently, for those of you who watch, we've changed the settings, so we set up everything in a new way. Every so often I get nervous. So let me just finish where I was with. Oh yes, in 1981 it was. Ananda Village tried to incorporate as a California city. I was still in residence up there at that time because we wanted to get control over our own land use. We were and are in an unincorporated area of the county, and therefore the County Board of Supervisors controls land use at Ananda Village. It still does all these years later. That means zoning, what you can build and what the conditions are of building. And our neighbors, especially in the 1981, had strong opinions about what they didn't want us to do, and we had a hard time. We had a hard time getting our projects through the county for approval. And the only entity that had land use, control over its own land use, was a municipality, a city. Later, at the very end of the project, I started spelling city instead of C-I-T-Y. I started spelling it S-I-D-D-H-I, which means city, which is a completely free soul. I started calling it Ananda City at that point. But it was a very, very controversial project. I, with two other women, both of whom happened to be attorneys. I'm not, in this lifetime, an attorney, but it's a very close samskar with me. For 18 months, we worked on that, and it was intensely controversial. And each of the public hearings we had was put into a larger and larger hall in the county until by the last public hearing, it was in a hall that held like 700 people, and there were 700 people there. And all of them were against what we were doing, except those who were actually resident of Ananda. And the county agency, the the board, Local Area Formation Committee, LAFCO, of the 7 members, 6 voted against us and only 1 voted for us. So it was very controversial, and I had to go to all these meetings where everybody was against what we were doing, and I had to answer their questions and like this. And we didn't succeed in the effort, as I just described, for many reasons. And in the end, Swami felt that we'd done enough and we abandoned the effort. I tell the story in a couple of the books I wrote about Swami. But the end of all of it was, Swamiji said, I wanted you to do this because you have a tendency to tell people what they want to hear, which I didn't really realize that. This was the second time he'd said that to me. You have a tendency to tell people what they want to hear, and having to stand up in such a controversial situation and just stick with what you were saying. No, actually, he's right, because I was on a radio show during that cycle, and they challenged me in a certain way, and I didn't have the spine to just hold my ground. I kept trying to find a way to modify our position. Yeah, I remember that. It was awful. So, sometimes we don't see ourselves as we really are, but Swami could see me. And so at the end of that project, when we failed completely, he said, well, the main reason I wanted you to do it was because you need to learn this to be a good minister. So I remember going to the community, and we had spent $30,000 on the effort, which at that time, 1981, in $81, and in the economy of Ananda Village, it was a huge amount of money. And it had just been all for nothing. Well, not really, because a lot of other good things happened, but in any case, it was all for nothing. And I remember sitting in front of the community and telling them that Swami said it would make me a better minister, and I hope they didn't mind investing $30,000 in my future. People were kind enough to say it was okay, because that's how it went. But it was real, and I did need that, and apparently in 2002, Swami wanted to either tweak me up or tone me up or remind me or reprimand me. I don't really know. So that was that one. So now, this one is June 13th, the year 2000, and Swami is responding on resolving a potential conflict over money. Yes, I think I will use my this. By now, Swami writes, by now I tried to think about what this was about, and I actually wondered if this was also a letter to me, because I was caught up in a similar situation. But I don't think this was a letter to me. I didn't find it. I didn't find a copy of it. And the situation doesn't quite fit, but we'll see. By now, I have heard several views on these funds. I think the best thing you can do at this point is to give blank or to blank to be put into a fund specifically marked for the specific project, and step out of any position that could or might be regarded as controlling. The bad blood that might result from not doing so could damage many other things in future relations. The good blood from this concession, on the other hand, could help those same things in future relations. This part of it sounds very familiar to me. There was a time, and it was 2000, probably around 2000. Let me think for a second. No, the situation that we were personally involved in was much earlier, so it wasn't about us. But we were involved in a situation that I just will describe, where there was a person on the staff, and they wanted to control all the money related to their project. And those of us who had more authority over that staff person did not feel that they really had the maturity to handle the money. So they couldn't be totally self-sufficient in how they spent the money. They always had to work with us. And it caused tremendous resentment. And what I'm trying to remember is whether Swami gave us this exact same advice. It's just not worth creating all that resentment. Just hand the money over. But I can't pull the details up. Money has many times throughout history been a cause of conflict and strife. The human element, the friendship, trust, and harmony, is more important than money. And though you yourself feel that this is precisely what you may not feel certain of having in them, which is trust, harmony, and friendship, if you don't bite the bullet, you'll damage things irreparably for the future. It isn't worth it. There's a story in my book, Swami Kriyananda's We Have Known Him. And this is a situation that took place after Swami moved to India in 2003. At one point, Swami was working with a person in India who was an old friend of his, someone he'd known from his first time in India in 1958. This is 2003, he's in India. And this person had been a close friend of his from 1958 to 1962 when Swami was in India the first time for SRF. And this friend welcomed Swami back with great enthusiasm, and Swami embraced him as a brother, and they were all working together. And that man, because we were just starting out, was also involved in the finances of what was going on. And there was a fair amount of money coming into India at that point from America and from Europe in order to launch Ananda. And at one point, this very old and dear friend of Swamiji's took $10,000 out of the Ananda account and put it into his personal account for his personal use. And it was, $10,000 is a lot of money in any circumstance, and when you're launching a work with donations, $10,000 is a solid sum. And, those involved very privately had to bring it to Swami because they didn't know what to do. This was Swami's friend, and they didn't know what to do. And Swami said, most people value money more than they value friendship. He said, I value friendship. He said, this man obviously feels justified in his own mind. If I were to confront him on it, he would justify why he'd done it. He said, and I would lose the friendship. He said, I'd rather keep the friendship. And then he said, if Divine Mother wants us to have that money, she'll give it back to us in some way. And then that was the end of the matter. The man just kept the money. Swami never said a word about it. And that was that. And so here Swami is saying, money has, many times throughout history, been a cause of conflict and strife. The human element, friendship, trust, and harmony, though, Swami says, is more important than money. And though, yes, you yourself feel that is precisely what you're not certain about in having in them, if you don't bite the bullet, you'll damage things irreparably for the future. If you take a stand now and say, I don't trust you to handle this money, I don't think it's right for you to handle this money, Swami says, we'll never recover. So Swami just says, just let him have the money, essentially. I mean, I'm anticipating that the problem was very similar to the one that we faced. We don't really trust that these people, whoever they are, ours was a singleton, theirs is more than one, that we don't really trust that these people will use this money appropriately. But Swami said, let it go. So, they too want what you want, meaning to have a success of the project. And I'm very sure at this point that they'll never spend that money for any other purpose, now that there's been such a stink made about them not being reliable to handle the money properly. They're certainly going to handle it very properly at this point because they are insulted already. And so they're going to prove that any suspicion about them was completely unjustified. Swami knows human nature. Whatever they might have done before, whether the suspicions were true or not, whatever they might have done to misuse it, now they'll be scrupulous about using it properly. They will, however, remember that you didn't trust them to do so. And the more conscientious they are about fulfilling their side of the bargain, the greater the bitterness that will remain in their hearts. Because they will prove you so wrong. At present, I should add, Swami goes on to say, there is no bitterness. It hasn't advanced to that point. Swami's just saying this is what will happen if you're not careful. But I see clouds on the horizon. In all situations relating to interpersonal matters, human feelings are an essential consideration, so much so that reason is never the whole or even the primary issue. So presumably whoever Swami's writing to had tried to explain it all very reasonably. Well, this is it, this was the assignment, this was the agreement, this is what we decided we would do, and now that this is what we've decided, this is what we will do. And Swami said all that reason doesn't really mean anything. It's human feeling. These people have now developed an emotional response. And to sort of come back with reason when they have developed an emotional response will just create disharmony. And Swami says, you have your own feelings, they have theirs. Were you to back off, I think it would go a long way toward smoothing things over in the future. So, and Swami, does he say it here? Or maybe it's the next letter where he says it. Let me just see. No, it's not exactly here. But it's just like when there is a choice, he says, when you have a choice in a situation, if at all possible, choose unity and harmony. Don't let lesser considerations get in the way. So, now here's another one. This is actually slightly different. This is very interesting. This is in 2001, in January. What happened here, there was a department in the community, and it was related to Swami's creative work. It was related to the music. Swami had worked very hard to actually build up. It was surprisingly difficult over many years at Ananda to really build up a department of creative arts that was just for creative arts, where people could really support themselves primarily with music. You would think it would have been easier, but it wasn't. It was always, because the music itself was not a financial entity, financially viable entity. There was other letters, and I recall there was a long letter where Swami was, right after he moved to Italy, and he was writing to people in charge and saying, please don't dissolve this creative department now after I've spent so much time building it up. So here's another situation. Swami was actually in Europe at this time, and he'd worked really hard to build up this department. But the person in charge abused their position of leadership. They abused their position of leadership in ways that they were not honorable in their relationships with the people. They were not always honest in their relationships with the people, and they were not appropriate in the way they used the money. And there was a fairly large amount of money involved. And it was pretty bad. And Swami had put a tremendous amount of effort over many years to get the department in order and to get the individual in charge, to work, to give them an appropriate responsibility and give them an opportunity. And it just was a catastrophe. And it all sort of came out. It had been hidden, and then it all came out. And it came out in the morning, and by the afternoon, the whole department was closed. And Swami that's it, the whole department is closed. Swami said, I would rather lose everything than support something that's not dharmic. And what was going on in that department with this one individual was not Dharma. And that was just that. But Swami wrote this letter probably to Jyotish and Devi, because Swami was in Europe and they were the ones who were going to have to carry it out. I'm not certain it was to them, but I'm pretty sure it was. And basically, as you'll see when I read it here, what he was saying to them is, I understand, given everything, that you want to maintain this department if you possibly can. But you have to understand that this is a matter of Dharma, and I support you completely in doing the right thing here. Because they didn't want to disappoint him. So this is the 15th of January, 2001. I am distressed that, and then Swami's talking about the person who was in charge. I am distressed that the person in charge has not told me the whole story, because this man was also not being honest with Swami. He gives me whatever he thinks will please me. But what can please me, really? Only this, to see things done in a godly way. Otherwise, what is the point of the music itself? So the person in charge was sort of just withholding. There was a lack of honesty there. Even very great devotees, we all have weaknesses. And this individual was self-protective and lacked trust. Unfortunately, that person did not survive this test, and so they're no longer with Ananda. But I'll tell you that in a moment. At any rate, don't hesitate to do what is right dharmically. I know you both believe in the music and don't discount its importance. And that's what it was, is that Swami had already been pleading with us to respect the creative work. So they were very hesitant to do anything that was just going to be such a huge setback. He wanted them to know, go right ahead. But we believe in God and Guru first. If the music scene doesn't serve the cause of Dharma, it cannot be pleasing to God and Guru, and has no more value than a speck of dust. Given things that Swami had been saying for years earlier, this is really an extreme statement. Nothing is worth violating divine principles. That's a very important point, because many times even spiritual organizations can justify just a little bit of adharma, just a little bit of bending the rules a little because of all the good we're doing. Swami said, absolutely not. And this was really one of the most dramatic examples in Ananda's history. Just no, that's all. As soon as Swami understood what was going on, it was closed. Leaving my personal feelings out of the picture then, but understanding rather that my feelings support whatever is right, don't fear to do whatever you have to do. Love from Swami. Swami was so good and so supportive. And even with the person who was causing the difficulty, Swamiji invited them to come to Europe. He invited them to come and help Swami in Europe. In other words, Swami's response when someone exposes a weakness in their character is always, how can we help? When someone exposes a weakness, Swami does not respond by saying, out, you're not worthy. Just the opposite. It's, how can I help you? I mean, if that individual really has shown a deep devotion and a commitment, which this individual had. Swami invited him to come to Europe, and then invited him to stay and work with Swami there, but the man was, he just couldn't rise above the embarrassment of being exposed. He just couldn't do it. And basically left. Ananda never came back. It was very hard on all of us. But it was a line in the sand that Swami, because Swami is very, he would always choose people, just like the other letter about the money, and just don't let, the money's not worth it. Let them squander the money if they're going to, but if you hold on to the money, it's not going to bring us what we want, so just risk the money or let it go. It's not worth it. But in this case, too much was improper. Then the individual just couldn't rise to it. I remember another situation which was trivial by comparison, but an individual, they might have gotten fired. I can't quite remember clearly, but something had happened where they'd lost their job, and they'd lost their job for cause, and they were more than a little, they were very embarrassed about it. And the person came to me and I said, Ananda is the most forgiving family that I've ever seen. It's like we all know that we're all here to work on ourselves, and when something happens and it just, one of our own weaknesses is exposed in such a way that everybody knows it. I mean, people do not delight in the downfall of others. In fact, it's just the opposite. There's this tremendous outpouring of sympathetic support, because we all know that we all have karma that's just lurking and waiting for the moment. And we even have a concept called karmic bombs, where just, some big bit of karma just comes to the surface and explodes on you. And I said, if you can just find it within yourself to just go out and meet your friends and keep your chin up and look people right in the eye, everyone will admire you for your courage and your humility, and within 24 hours it'll be forgotten, which is exactly what happened. So that individual, instead of running away in embarrassment, just said, everybody has their bad days and this is mine. And then people just applauded them for their perseverance. That's what we're here for. Ananda is very unusual that way. Very unusual. And it's because of Swamiji. When we were under attack in the late 90s for the lawsuit that was meant to destroy Swami's reputation and ours, when we were accused of being an abusive cult. And the heart of it, the catalyst for the whole thing, was a married man who had an affair with a single woman in the community, a consensual adult affair, but the man was a minister, although he was not acting in a ministerial role. He was in business at the time. And she was no innocent, but it became the fuel for this charge of Ananda's complete moral corruption. Let me see now, what are the pieces of this? What are the relevant pieces? Oh, but the man, his family situation had been very difficult at that point, and the stress was too much for him. But he pulled himself together. He had a special needs child, and it was just, there was a lot of stress. He pulled himself together. He recommitted himself to the marriage and to his child, and that was where it was. But she was furious. She was really furious, the other woman, so to speak. Blah, blah, blah. The whole thing rolls out and became utterly embroiled in our dispute with the other religious organization. All of that is just background for the other part I want to say. And this thing went on, and Swami's response to that situation was the same as it was for the man who was behaving unscrupulously in that department, which is he wanted to help. These things happen, is how Swami puts it. You can't always control the feelings of the heart. There's a tremendous amount of strain. There were just lots of things. Swami wanted the man to stay with his marriage. He didn't tell him to do so, but it was the right choice. And when he made that choice, it's not that divorce is unthinkable, but in these circumstances, in these particular individuals, it was the right choice, or it was the higher choice. And so Swami supported that. And because of all the personalities involved, Swami favored not making a big public display, for two reasons. Because the wife was a very private person, and it would have been almost unbearable for her to have this public thing, this private thing presented. And the other thing was for the other woman, As Swami said, in situations like this, sympathy tends to go for the wife, and judgment tends to go toward the other woman. So for her sake also, Swami wanted it not to be publicly. He didn't want any public exposure. All of that got totally twisted in the course of the lawsuit because it was a wild and woolly experience, which I've written about in other places and also talked about in the course of this book. But what we ended up getting criticized for was trying to help them, because rules had been broken and people should have been punished. And the fact that people weren't punished, but instead an effort was made to help everyone, that was criticized as terribly improper. And it took me a while to sort of figure out that that was what was really going on, because all of that thought can be couched in all kinds of other ways. Now, believe me, I know this is a very complicated subject, but I stand by what I'm saying. And finally, and this whole thing was happening in a courtroom that's just about 3 miles from our church. So it was we all knew all about it. So I remember one Sunday Sunday sermon that I gave when I finally got straight what was really going on, which is that according to what the lawyers were trying to make true, we should have just, picked up a cudgel and, beaten everybody with a stick and then stripped them of all their possessions and all their integrity and thrown, the man out into the snow. I mean, it was horrible. What was really being asked of us was horrible. And I remember I just said, I'd rather lose everything than become that kind of narrow-minded, judgmental, mean-spirited, no hope if you make a mistake kind of religious organization. I don't want to have any part of that. We're here to help each other. And everybody has their weaknesses. And yes, there are lines you can't cross. But we also have to look at each other as brothers and sisters and see what we can do to help each other to go forward. I said it very passionately because I got a standing ovation. It's the only time in 40 years of Sunday services that I've ever gotten a standing ovation for a sermon. But I felt it very passionately. And that's how Swami Kriyananda has trained us. So Ananda we're not, what would you say? We're not soft on crime. We don't lack morality. In fact, we have profound morality. But loyalty and friendship is also one of them. And it's something to consider. Our society as a whole, especially on this issue, on the issue of money and sexuality especially, our society is a little crazy and is just out to lynch each other at the slightest show of weakness. I don't think it's a good plan. I don't think it's going to really bring anybody what they really want. It makes everybody terrified, frightened. It's very, very tough. These are complicated issues. I recognize that. But the small community solution is one of the things we have to work with, where we really know each other and really work together for the highest good. So that's that. And now we're out of the section called leadership. And now we're into the section called yoga and Christianity. It's so funny. I was reading several of these letters over this afternoon. I kept thinking, they're all about Jesus. And then I took the trouble to notice the section. Of course, they're all about Jesus because this is all about yoga and Christianity. And it goes on for a little while. So we're going to settle now into something completely new. Okay. So the first letter, which is written in November of 2000, the writer asked Swami, do you consider yourself and Ananda basically Hindu or a mixture of faiths and traditions? Swami says, your question is very easy to answer, but more difficult to understand. However, I think you'll be able to understand it without difficulty. What we teach is not at all a mixture. See, people tend to think, well, you take a little of this and a little of that, you mix it all up together. But what we teach is not at all a mixture. Yogananda taught that truth is one and eternal. Christ taught it. Krishna taught it. We have Christ on our altar and have deep devotion to him. In fact, Yogananda told us Jesus had appeared to Babaji, our first guru after Jesus himself, in the Himalayas, and asked him to send someone to the West to bring people his inner teachings. Jesus, we say this in the Festival of Light every week, Jesus appeared to the great master Babaji. The lights on the high altar of my church have been growing dim. This is what's in the Festival of Light. Though still lit on lower altars of good works, the noble taper of inner communion with the Lord burns low and is ill-attended. Let us together, united in Christ's love, set lights ablaze on that high altar once again. When Jesus says Christ's love, he doesn't mean the sectarian love of Christianity. He means Christ's love is Christ's consciousness. Let us together, in a state of God realization, bring the teaching of inner communion back again. So that's his inner teachings. And so Yogananda was the result of that divine mission of the Himalayan masters. That energy was set in motion. Lahiri Mahashaya, then Sri Yukteswar, and finally Yogananda was born. And all of them are bringing back this teaching of inner communion. Master's mission, as he said, was to bring back the original teachings of Krishna and the original teachings of Jesus, and to show that in their essence, they are the same teaching. So there is also an element of restoring on the Eastern side also the original teachings, which, as Swami said, it's like an overgrown tree that needs to be pruned at this point. I don't know whether, he says to this person to whom Swami's writing, I don't know whether you've read Autobiography of a Yogi or my book, The Path, which is about my life with Yogananda. I would say we are true Christians and true Hindus and true anything that holds that divine truth, is inward, not institutional. And that's where the real reality here comes, that Jesus' teachings are one thing, what the church presents as his teachings are something else. And the teachings of Krishna are one reality. What has become the Hindu tradition over so much time does not necessarily reflect accurately or completely what it was, what the revelation was that Krishna himself brought. In the same way, speaking personally, I don't really belong to, let me see if there's more I wanted to say about that. When I went to India for the first time in 1986, I was a little surprised to realize how non-Hindu our teachings were. When I went to India in 2004 and 5 and had to, I was allowed to, at Swami's request, to teach, do some classes and so on in India. At first I was excessively respectful of what the people who had been raised in the Indian culture knew about the teachings that I thought I was representing. And I still am. There's just vast arenas of knowledge that people raised in that culture know that I don't know. I know a little about the Mahabharata and a little bit about the Gita, Bhagavad Gita I know, and a little bit about the Ramayana. But, what people can say to me just off the top of their head just makes me realize I just know a little bit. But after a while, after I'd been there, or been there more than once, the timing is a little vague in my mind, I realized that They may know more about the Hindu tradition, but what Master taught was a new expression. That's what he described it when Swami asked him, are your teachings a new religion? Master said, no, but they're not a new religion, but they are a new expression. And that new expression is not Hinduism, nor is it Christianity. It's the original teachings of Jesus and the original teachings of Krishna, and they go together. Master taught from the Bhagavad Gita and from the Bible. Master wrote commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita and the New Testament to show that the inner communion message of those teachings is all exactly the same. But the Hindu rituals and all the traditions that are involved in Hinduism is just something else. And I realized very interestingly after spending time in India that Master's teachings were about as Hindu as they are Catholic, which is not very. But you can see elements. You can see where it came from. It's not against those teachings. It's just something else. It's not a blend. It's not gathering here and there. It's withdrawing from the outward expression back to the point of origin, attuning to that point of origin, and then bringing it forward again. And I gradually became very comfortable in India, even though people can teach me many things that I find very interesting, that I enjoy knowing. But what I'm bringing is what I learned from Swami, which is just something else. I was raised neither a Catholic nor a Hindu. I don't know either of those traditions in the way that a lifelong practitioner would, but I don't need to, because this is a new expression, is what we're working with. Somebody with greater knowledge can tie the pieces together, but it's not necessary. So then Swami says, in the same way, speaking personally, I don't really belong to any nationality, although my passport is American. Swami says, I was born in Romania of American parents, lived there 13 years, have lived in many countries, including India. Above all, however, I find myself to be a citizen of the world and manage pretty well to get along in 8 or so languages. Here, he's in Assisi, Italy, when he writes this. Here, I lecture in Italian, but I've also lectured in French, Spanish, and German. English is, of course, my mother tongue. I speak Bengali and Hindi, though not well, because educated Indians mostly speak English and wouldn't let me converse with them in their own languages. Romanian I've pretty well forgotten, though I could pick it up again in a month or so if I had a reason to. So Swami's just saying, with all those different elements playing, it's really hard to say what nationality he is. In fact, when I would describe Swami, I would say he travels on an American passport, because that's sort of, but to call him an American is not really true. He himself says he feels more at home in the European culture anyway than the American one. As for religion, Swami says, it isn't that I'm against institutions. They certainly have their place. But for myself, my interest and devotional direction is self-realization, viewing God, not the ego, as our true self. Finding God and helping others to find Him is my only interest in life. Other interests are all subordinate to that single aim. He said it's not that he's against religious institutions, but what he thinks about is self-realization. What he thinks about is not outward rituals and practices and traditions and, declarations of faith. It's inner experience that is Swami's spiritual life. I hoped here in Italy to develop some sort of dialogue with the church. Now here we start in this whole thing. Swami wrote the Oratorio in 1983-84 when he wasn't living in Italy, but he was closely involved at that point with a group of charismatic Catholics that he met in Sorrento. And he hoped through the music of the oratorio, which is, an oratorio is a way of telling the life story of Christ in music. And so Swami wrote this beautiful, which we still use and sing. And he hoped it, plus his contact with these charismatic Catholics, would provide a bridge for what he named the movement of inner communion. He thought it would be a wonderful way to approach the Catholics who were extremely familiar with the communion ritual, that he could just take them the next step. So we commune through the ritual, but then we commune deeply inwardly. And he thought the music would provide an experience that could then help launch this movement, and his Catholic friends, who were already inside the church, could help make it work. It didn't. It was a powerful effort that he tried for a number of years. But in Italy, it never got traction anywhere. He tried both in the U.S., but especially in Italy. It just never happened. So he's saying, I had hoped here in Italy to develop some sort of dialogue with the church, but I was severely rebuffed by the local bishop, the bishop in Assisi. Since then, I have stopped attending their church services and bow to them in my heart only from afar. He says it here, the church itself in Italy and really all over the world is in conflict with itself. And the bishop in Assisi happened to be a very, very conservative bishop. And I don't know if it's in this book or not, but Swami tried to speak to him without any success. Swami says, I lived for 6 months at New Camaldoli, near Big Sur, California. This was when Swami was expelled from SRF in 1962. He didn't really get Ananda started until 67. And when he was just really at loose ends and didn't really know quite what to do with himself, he went and stayed in their monastery for about 6 months. He was in retreat, but not quite. I lived for 6 months at New Camaldoli near Big Sur, California. They allowed him to stay because they were hoping I'd convert to Catholicism and join their order. But I could not have done so sincerely. In fact, they finally asked him to leave because he was very charismatic and his conversation was not helping the monks. He tried to be very respectful, but he just represented something that was not consistent, entirely consistent. So much as they liked him, they had to ask him to leave. I respect the Catholic monastic orders, however, and particularly that one. And I feel, at least in spirit, that we are working toward the same ends. I think, however, that by the local church authorities I am viewed, if not with hostility, at least with considerable suspicion and reservation. He means there, the local, he means there in Italy. And there was also a priest in one of the nearby towns. Thousands come yearly to the retreat I have founded. They bring money to the area and visit the pilgrimage spots, the portuncula, etc., with deep devotion. But they are considered, well, different. We settled in Assisi, Italy, in the late 80s, outside of the city, 20 miles outside of the city in a rural area. But over the years, we've become a fixture in the town, and we bring lots of groups of devotees, and we're very, very expressive and devotional. And many of the people who visit us are Catholic in their upbringing. So we interact a lot so they know us. And they consider us, well, different, because we have this deep devotion, but we don't express it, we don't behave in quite the same way. I think the day will come when the church considers me and what I stand for to be a major threat. Swami's taking it a step further. Right now they hold me at a distance. I think in time they will see us as a threat. Master actually said that persecution of self-realization would come from the Catholics. We haven't seen it yet, but that's what he said. That day hasn't come yet, and I'd love to think it never will, for we don't, in fact, threaten anyone. We represent, however, a dynamic teaching, and the bishop thinks in terms of holding his flock together under the outspread wings of the church. That is not my faith or my interest. Now, I'll just give you a little context for sort of all of this. Let me think what happened here. First, I just found this note when I was actually looking to see. I have lots of files of notes from all these years. I was looking to see if I had that other email. And I also just was looking up the Catholic Church in Italy. And from September of 2000, let's see what this is. Yeah, this is November of 2000, so this was just a little earlier. But there had been some sort of stirrings because of this meeting Swami had with the bishop, which I'll tell you about in a moment. Swami remarked that he talked about 3 serious tests that the Catholic Church has been through. He said the first test for the Church was the alternative presented by the Gnostics, and this was in the early centuries of the Church. The Gnostics were an inner communion aspect of the Church. The Church was, I don't know church history well enough, so I have to just sort of say this in a very general way. But they were institutionalizing and organizing, getting their authority, that the priests were the authority, and this is who you listen to, and this is how you did it. The Gnostics asserted that everyone has a direct relationship with the divine. See, what makes it institutional religion, and I've said this before, what makes it institutional religion is not that it's organized, not that it has a priesthood, let's say, or a pope even, or a scripture, or a rule for the monastic life. None of that makes it an institution. That's just organizing itself, so it'll be easier for people to relate. You have to organize to a certain extent. It's too hard for people to understand what you're doing unless you bring it into some order. And when you have numbers of people, it just becomes necessary. You have to be practical in your idealism. So organizing is not the problem. It's when the institution itself is a necessary intermediary between the devotee and God, that you have to be a Catholic in order to be saved, for example. And, that is a teaching, that, you're lucky enough to get to be a Catholic, and then you get to be saved. You have to follow these sacraments, you have to, do it this way, you have to have these rituals, and that's what determines. If you don't come to Mass, if you miss Mass too often, then you're condemned, and it's like the institution starts telling you what you have to do to be saved. And then it starts determining whether or not you're saved according to whether or not you did this. And you have to have a priest to do this for you. And Hinduism is also, Hinduism is better, but Hinduism has this weird aspect. As one of my first Indian friends said to me, he was talking about, he bought an apartment, but he couldn't move into it until the astrologically auspicious day, which was 5 months after he paid the last money. And he couldn't possibly move into it until the proper Hindu rituals were carried out. And he couldn't carry out any of those rituals themselves because they were much too complicated. There was an entire caste of priests, pujaris, an entire caste of pujaris who made their living carrying out the rituals that were required for the Hindu faith, but that no devotee could do for themselves, because they were too specialized and you had to know all this stuff. So my friend, he had to have his apartment consecrated by the priest, which included building a fire in the living room, breaking coconuts against the walls, which required that the whole place had to be cleaned and repainted before he could move in. But absolutely all of it had to be done. That was just, he said it was just unthinkable not to. And that was when he said to me, Hinduism is, he said, the only religion in the world that you have to pay someone else to practice for you. And that's when it becomes a difficulty, because you shouldn't have to pay someone else to practice. Now, I'm not arguing against those rituals, and I'm not arguing against those pujaris, but that's when things begin to get confused. And the Gnostics in the early Christian years were saying that we all have our personal relationship with God. You know, there's no priestly caste, there's no institution, there's no group that can say whether or not I am in tune with God or saved by Jesus Christ. In all probability, I mean, we sort of joke at Ananda that we were the Gnostics. You know, in our previous incarnation, we were making this argument. The reason most people don't know it is because the institutional church succeeded in suppressing the Gnostics. And then church history just kind of wiped them off the board, or characterized them as some sort of lunatic fringe that, thank God, we were able to get rid of. But so Swami says the first test Catholic Church faced was the Gnostics. The second test was the test of science, when Swami said, where people wanted the test of reality to be based on their own experience rather than on authority, on just like the church says that, let me think, unfortunately I can't quite remember, but Galileo, who said, I think that the earth was not the center of creation, it wasn't the center of the universe, and because he tracked the orbits of the planets. But the church rejected him and they excommunicated him, because their theology says that Jesus Christ was the center of everything, and Jesus Christ was born on this planet, and therefore this had to be the center of the whole universe. And when he was trying just by scientific evidence to show that the way the physical world was organized, it didn't quite lead to that same conclusion. So they excommunicated him. They declared that he was going to go to hell forever. Because if you were excommunicated from the Catholic Church, if you weren't a Catholic, and even worse, if you offended the Catholic Church to such an extent that you were excommunicated, you would go to hell for all eternity. It was a very, very powerful way to keep people in line. You know, and it worked. I mean, it was scary. This was your belief, and you were going to go to hell for all eternity if you displeased these people. You had to have a lot of power to stand against that. Well, that was and you know, it was only relatively recently that Galileo was released from his eternal damnation and forgiven for what he said. Now, I think I have the details of that right. Now, Swami says the Catholic Church is facing a third test, which is to recognize the oneness of all religions. And so far it's not doing so well. I mean, there are many, many broad-minded people who are either in the hierarchy or Catholics. But the official position has been, this present Pope is being different than any other Pope before him, but until very, very recently, the official position, when you cut through everything, is that it's nice that these people do all this, but if you really want to be saved, you have to become a Catholic. And so this is the test that they're facing now, and it's a huge fight. And so this particular bishop in Assisi is not one who's embracing the oneness of all faiths. And so what happened earlier, how Swami ended up in this situation with this bishop, is an article appeared in a tourist magazine about our retreat, the Ananda retreat, which is has been a very, very successful enterprise. Hundreds and hundreds of people from all over Europe come and have been coming. It started in Lake Como in the early 80s and moved to Assisi in 1986, actually. And it's been in Assisi ever since. They have a lovely place and a beautiful temple, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful place. And so there was an article in some kind of a tourist magazine, or it might have even been a Catholic magazine, but I don't think so. But maybe it was. And it was about our retreat, and among other things that were said was there was some of the staff for the article, I guess, spoke of the blessings of St. Francis and the blessings of St. Clare, we moved to Assisi from Lake Como, where we had been given a house to use. I'm using the royal we here because I wasn't there. But everything about Ananda to me is we. So we moved there because it's the most holy place in Italy. And St. Francis is well, what Master would call he's a saint in our line. I mean, he's consistent with the self-realization teachings. So, and Master called St. Francis his patron saint. So Francis has been very dear to us in our spiritual practice. And so it was a natural place for us to be. I think many of us were with St. Francis and St. Clare. So in this magazine article, our staff made reference to them as an inspiring force, and it's a constant blessing. The bishop was offended that we dared to imagine, and much less to assert, that these Catholic saints were also blessing our work. And it wasn't, and there may have been a rebuttal article that came out somewhere, I'm not sure. But in any way, this is how it started. So Swamiji went to see the bishop. He was hoping by personal contact to bridge the difference. But he found instead that the bishop was rock hard against what we were doing. Syncretism, I think that's the word, where you draw on bits and pieces of many faiths and then stitch them together into something, is considered a very bad thing in the Catholic Church. It's not considered something admirable. It's a very bad thing. And that bishop tried to say that's who we were. He'd seen our Festival of Light, which basically draws from the original teachings of Jesus and the original teachings of Krishna, and presents this ritual in a new way. And it also makes reference to this Festival of Light being essentially our version of the Mass. And so the bishop saw all of this and did not like any of it. And Swami tried every way he could to bridge, and there was just no way. The bishop just simply would not. There was no opening that he would accept. Finally, Swami, at the very end, was able to say, well, you know, whether we agree or not, the real enemy to both of us is atheism. And I think he was able to get a little bit of support for that, but I'm not even sure that he was from the bishop. And so Swami's remark after that, he just said, stay out of his way. He said, just make no effort to try to make a bridge with this man, because he will never accept us. And then one person did make an overture, even after Swami said not to. He said, you're not going to win him by showing him how nice we are. It's just not going to, he's not going to be persuaded. He's made a decision, and this is who he is. And Master said, you know, it could get worse, that there could be active, aggressive opposition to it. But we haven't seen it yet, so let's hope it doesn't come. So let me just see. Okay, I think, even though I have a couple of minutes left, I'm not going to start a new letter, so I think I'm just going to stop it at this point. Thank you very much. Oh, you know, but I do feel to say, let me just finish this thought. There have been many priests in Italy that we have a very sweet relationship with, who are different, who do recognize that we are not each other's enemies. We are friends in the spirit, and there is an enemy, and it isn't each other. But the position of that bishop has made it more difficult, because they're not able to, you know, there was a time when there was more of an easy flow, but the position of that very, very conservative bishop has made it more difficult. I was remembering here, before we had a church here in Palo Alto for Ananda before we bought this wonderful church building that we have. But once a year we would rent somebody else's church and put on a big festival for Yogananda in January. So we rented a church from a congregational church or something like that, some sort of middle-of-the-road Christian church. And we decorated the hall and put up pictures of our gurus and all of that. And then apparently the minister of that church heard about what we did, and I came back the next year because it was a very satisfactory place. And I said we wanted to rent it again. And he'd heard sort of more about us, and he was a little cool. And so he asked me to come in to talk to him. So I went and talked to him, and he asked me more about who we were and what we were doing. And I told him that our teaching was based on the original teachings of Jesus and the original teachings of Krishna. I just told him very frankly what we were. And this minister sort of drew himself up and said, you know, our Yogananda, he doesn't presume to call himself a Christian, does he? And I drew myself up and said, he most certainly does. He does not draw his teachings master through any church denomination, but directly from attunement with Jesus. And of course, that did not go over well with the minister, and by that point I wouldn't have used his church if he'd given it to us for free. And very interestingly, later, some members of that church who got to know us apologized to us for his behavior. And I don't think he actually lasted as the minister, because all Christians are facing the question of recognizing the truth of all religions, and many are rising to it, but others are not. And so this is what we're working with, and we'll see what the world brings us later as decades pass. Okay, my friends, God bless you.